welcome to our next episode of the Hormone Café. Today, we're going to talk about perimenopause. Things that I want to go over are, what is perimenopause? How do you know if you have it? What are some of the symptoms of perimenopause? And then what do we do to treat it? Because here at Vera Health and Fertility, I think the approach that we use for all of our hormonal imbalances or hormonal transition phases in our life work really well for that perimenopausal transition too. So what is perimenopause? Basically, when we're born, we are born with all of the eggs that we're ever going to have, and our egg quality slowly decreases over time, which means that our ovarian function also slowly decreases over time. And so slowly over time, our ovaries will make less and less and less hormones, most specifically estrogen and progesterone and testosterone. However, when we go through perimenopause, our ovaries don't just have this beautiful, gradual, downward decrease of the hormone production. What happens is that it starts making hormones much more sporadically. So sometimes really high, and then really low, and then really high, and then nothing, and then a lot of hormones. And that process of this irregular, sporadic hormone production as our ovaries are moving into barely making any hormones at all, where we have no periods, and that's called menopause. So perimenopause is when we go from making hormones like we did in our childbearing years to making no hormones. But instead of being this beautiful downward progression, it's this huge roller coaster where we're making a lot and then none and a lot and then none. And how that manifests itself is our symptoms can become really wild and all over the place. So you can be super duper anxious one day and super duper depressed one day and have horrible brain fog and have a lot of thermoregulation issues where you feel really, really hot or really, really cold, have a ton of night sweats or a lot of hot flashes, or you just feel like you're tired all the time, or your brain isn't working properly, or your metabolism is totally gone and you're working out and you're eating really well and you're still gaining all this weight. So those are some of the symptoms that you can have when we go through that perimenopausal transition and you feel like your hormones have tons of ups and downs. So one thing to know is perimenopause is a natural thing. It's something that every single woman goes through. It's natural. It's not something that necessarily per se needs to be treated or needs to be medicated. However, sometimes because our hormones are produced in such irregular fashion, we can have these really, really awful and wild symptoms. And so really focusing on those different symptoms and where they're coming from and the hormonal imbalances and supplementing that can make what is a truly natural transition less horrible and sometimes much, much better, much, much easier. Because sometimes people say, oh, you're just in perimenopause or you're just in menopause, like you're naturally going to feel bad. But please do not accept that. If you are in perimenopause and you are not feeling well, it's not okay. There's lots of things that we can do about it. So perimenopause is that transition between making hormones in a truly regular and cyclic fashion to when we're in menopause and making no hormones at all. And it can last anywhere from 5 to 10 years, which is a really long time. Most of the time, we start perimenopause in our early to mid 40s. And then the average age of menopause, which is where we have no periods at all in the United States, is 50 to 51. So that process starts in our 40s, and then gradually we make less and less hormones until we get into our 50s and we stop having periods. But that is a little person dependent. Some people start perimenopause really, really early in their 30s. Some people don't start that perimenopausal transition until they're in their 50s. So those are some of the things that describe perimenopause. So how can we test for perimenopause? How do you know if you're in perimenopause? So when you're in perimenopause, your cycles will become more irregular. And you'll have some longer cycles, and then you'll have really, really short cycles where you have a period, and then 2 weeks later, you have another period. And that could be followed by this really high rise in your estrogen, followed by this extreme drop in your estrogen, which gives you an early period. Because you have to remember that your ovaries are going through a transitional phase, right? They're transitioning from having a regular ovulatory cycle every single month, having a period every 28, 30 days-ish, to going from having 0 periods at all. So that doesn't happen overnight. What happens is that your cycles actually do become more irregular. So you'll have some shorter cycles, some longer cycles, some ovulatory cycles, some anovulatory cycles, and over time, you'll have more anovulatory cycles than you do ovulatory cycles. So the way that we measure it and know for sure if you're in perimenopause is we check your blood, and we check for hormones called FSH and LH. So really in your childbearing years when you're making hormones in proper amounts, you want your FSH and LH to be less than 10. And then as we move into that perimenopause, those numbers are going to creep up more to be 10 and 20. And then when we're in full-blown menopause, our LH and our FSH are more going to be like 25 or higher. So if we check your blood and then we check your ovary quality or your egg quality, plus your brain hormones, your LH and your FSH, it can give us a sense of where you are in that menopausal or perimenopausal spectrum. FSH and LH are hormones that your brain makes. Those are the hormones that talk to your ovaries and tell your ovaries to make more estrogen and more hormones. So as our ovaries make less and less and less estrogen, our brain has to work a lot harder to talk to our ovaries and tell it to make estrogen. And that is where that reflection of our brain hormones going up means that we're in perimenopause, because now our brain's trying really hard to talk to our ovaries to get it to make LH, to get it to make estrogen and progesterone and a little bit of testosterone. So another thing that's really, really important is that you want to check your LH and FSH multiple times, because just how we talked about in perimenopause, you'll make hormones very irregularly. Sometimes you'll check your blood work and everything will quote unquote look normal, meaning your estrogen levels will look normal, your LH and FSH will be less than 10, but then we check it 2 or 3 weeks later and now your estrogen is really high, like in the 400s, or really low, like in the 20s, and then your FSH and LH are closer to 15, 20, and then they can go right back down and go right back up. So because you have that irregular hormone production in perimenopause, it's extremely important to get multiple data points and check your hormones twice, at least 2 weeks apart, to make sure that you can trend over time and see what your hormones are doing over time. So blood work is a really great way. Doing blood work multiple times is a great way to check and see where you are in that perimenopausal spectrum and if you do in fact have perimenopause. So we briefly touched on some of the symptoms that you have in perimenopause. And again, this is just a natural transition that all people go through. However, if you're having symptoms, please advocate for yourself, because there are lots of things that we can do to help with those perimenopausal symptoms. For example, sometimes people have irregular cycles and it doesn't bother them, it doesn't affect them, they don't have any problems, and it doesn't affect their life. However, if you're having a period that's so irregular, or you're bleeding extremely heavy, you're bleeding through multiple pads and tampons, or bleeding through your clothes, or you have what I call a waterfall bleed, meaning you're bleeding for 2 weeks or 4 weeks at a time, or bleeding for a whole month and it's not stopping, those are big red flags. So if you have very irregular bleeding when you're on your period during perimenopause, that is when we need to intervene, because we can give some bioidentical hormones and some ovulation medication to ease that process, to make the highs not so high and the lows not so low as we're going through that transition. I think when we think of all of our approach, number one, we always want to start with nutrition. So in that perimenopausal phase, we want to make sure that we really are nourishing our bodies and making sure that we're eating enough calories, especially to promote and optimize our estrogen production and our testosterone production and our progesterone production. So we want to be checking our hormones and see where they are. And then we want to check the whole rest of your endocrine system, because even if you were to be on hormones during that perimenopausal time, if you don't fix any other things that could be off, hormones will not make you feel that great. And the whole goal is to be on the lowest dose of hormones possible to make you feel amazing every single day and not be super physiologic. Because when we think about hormone therapy, we want to make sure that we're giving you just enough that your body needs to supplement therapeutically what your body's supposed to be doing and guide it through that perimenopausal transition where the highs aren't so high and the lows aren't so low. However, we don't want you to be giving extremely high doses where you're shutting down your body, you're throwing off your body, or giving you too high of doses where we're going to grow cancer or cause you to have really irregular bleeding or blood clots. So when we do hormones, we do them in very low doses, very therapeutic, and we monitor and we measure them. So that's something that you have to know when you're on hormone therapy. If that's a good option for you, you want to make sure you know what kind of symptoms we're dealing with, how long are you going to be on hormone therapy, and then what's the end game? Because you don't want to be on hormones forever because your body's not going to make hormones forever. You want to have a plan to eventually wean off your hormones to just let your body go into menopause like it would do. So things that we want to look for other than just your hormones are, we want to look at your thyroid because it's very common that people tend to have a sluggish thyroid as they go through perimenopause. So we need to be looking at the building blocks of your thyroid: zinc, selenium, iodine, magnesium. Are we making enough of those? Are we getting the nutrition to support your thyroid? Do we need to do thyroid support supplements, or do we need to put you on thyroid medication? So please make sure that you draw a full thyroid panel. So your TSH, your T4, your T3 free in total, your reverse T3, and your thyroid antibodies to make sure that you're getting a full, complete picture of what your thyroid is doing. And then you also want to check your adrenal glands. So we check something called a DHEA and a DHEAS because a lot of times in perimenopause, we have a lot of fatigue. And sometimes that can be due to low hormones, but it can also be due to having adrenal fatigue and that your adrenal glands just aren't making enough cortisol and that you're not making enough to support your metabolism. So we want to check our adrenal glands and we want to check our thyroid. I also recommend doing nutrition testing in perimenopause because you want to make sure that you're having enough basic building blocks and elements like your magnesium and your zinc in order to support your body systems. And then you want to, of course, make sure you have proper mitochondrial function to support brain health and that you have enough omega-3s to make sure that you have the building blocks and the fats and the cholesterol needed that are the precursors to estrogen and testosterone. And then you want to make sure that we have enough B vitamins on board. So sometimes it's really helpful to know your nutritional status so that the first thing that you do, even before starting on any medication, is optimize what you're eating. Another thing that I often do in patients who have perimenopause is I have them do a continuous glucose monitor. And they wear a glucose monitor on the back of their arm for 15 days straight, and we look at their blood sugar. Because again, a lot of the symptoms that are associated with perimenopause, like insomnia, poor sleep, having a wired but tired feeling, just having your mind really racing right before you go to bed, there can be a lot of reasons that you have that. One of them can be hormones, but we want to make sure we're not missing the other things. So for example, sometimes people will eat right before they go to bed and their blood sugar will be high all night long, and that can cause a lot of sleep issues and just lead to chronic metabolic imbalances. Yep. So I really recommend checking your blood sugar, making sure your blood sugar is never too high or too low. Because if it's too low, your body's stressed, you're not nourishing yourself enough. And then if it's too high, we're fueling irregular estrogen production and also inflaming you. So if your blood glucose is on a huge roller coaster up and down all day long, then your hormones can also be on a huge roller coaster. So it's very important to make sure that all of those things are balanced because your body is going through a big change and it needs as much stabilization in all of those realms as possible. The other thing that I recommend is doing gut health testing because sometimes we're not absorbing our nutrition properly and you want to make sure that you're having a bowel movement every single day. You're never feeling bloated or gassy because you could be eating really well and taking all these supplements, and if you're not absorbing them properly, then it's all for naught and your body is not having the building blocks needed to make hormones in proper amounts as it goes through this massive transition. So when you're in perimenopause, you want to make sure you look at all the different body systems and your nutrition and your gut health test to make sure that we're not missing anything. So the core of what you want to do is nutrition. Like, we want to make sure that we're getting enough protein to stabilize our blood sugar, for example, not eating too many carbs at one time. Make sure we're spreading out our carbohydrates throughout the day, not eating before we go to bed, just to make sure our body is calming down at that time, making proper amounts of melatonin, and that we can fall asleep when we want to fall asleep and not have insomnia. And then other things that we want to think about are, then do we need to add in supplements? So the supplements that we think of are, if our hormones are really, really high, we think about supplements that are going to help us metabolize off our estrogen, like our DIM and our calcium D-glucarate. However, if our hormones are low, we do not want to be taking supplements that are going to lower our hormones. We want to be taking supplements that are going to nourish and enhance our hormone production, like DHEA, for example, can be really helpful. And then when we think about mood changes in perimenopause, a lot of that does come from hormonal extremes. It can be suddenly our estrogen's 400 and the very next day it's 10, and all of a sudden we feel super depressed and terrible and super irritable. And that can be helped with hormones, but then we also want to make sure that we're touching base with our mental health, because in that time, there's also a ton of stressors that are going on in our lives, right? We might be going through major career changes. We might be dealing with aging or sick parents. Our husbands or our partners might be going through career changes or different stages in their midlife. Our kids are aging, or maybe our kids are going to college. We're going through all these other transitions that can really derail our mental health. So it's very important to do a mental health check-in. We have a therapist here at Vera who specializes in this. So it's good to just have a third party, somebody else to just talk to, do a check-in with, make sure we're really getting all those aspects of our mental health as robust as we possibly can. So we really want to think about our mental health, because that also affects our production, our focus, our brain fog, right? Like, that is due to hormones, but it could also be due to a lot of other things that we have going on in our lives. So we can also use supplements for that kind of a thing. For example, if we're having issues focusing, we can do things like GABA, which support our neurotransmitters. And then if we're having trouble sleeping, we really want to see is what is going on. Why are you having trouble sleeping? It's because your mind is just racing all the time. Are we super stressed? Or is our cortisol really, really high at night right before we go to bed? Are we having an active nervous system? And then we need to retrain our nervous system and do some nervous system therapy. So I think perimenopause is really hard because there's just a lot of things that are going on, and sometimes we have to tackle all the things. However, I think people use perimenopause and they just feel like they're doomed to be feeling bad. But if you do the things, you can feel amazing. I have tons of patients who say, oh my gosh, Sarah, I feel better when I'm 45 than I did when I'm 35. And that is our goal for you. So even though it seems like a lot, if we tackle all the systems in a systematic fashion, we figure out what's going on, we support the systems, you can feel better. Like, do not just be doomed to be feeling bad if you're in perimenopause. Like, we really, really can make you feel better. So we talked about sleep is being super important and using, different supplements and therapies for that, and watching our glucose and our nutrition and our gut health. And then let's talk about hormones. So a lot of people are like, well, should I start hormones or not, right? Like, I don't want to be on hormones forever. I don't want to feel like I'm doomed to be on hormones. What's the end game for this? I'll say that if you're having subtle symptoms, we try to do everything possible with nutrition, exercise plans, and supplements. However, if you're having really, really awful symptoms, like you have drenching night sweats 5 or 6 days a week, you're waking up in the middle of the night, you have terrible insomnia, you have really, really bad brain fog, if it's very extreme, you're going to find that even taking supplements, it will just take the edge off. It's not going to make you a new person. So if you are a person who has just really, really low hormones, then you will feel better if you're on hormone replacement therapy. So like I talked about before, when you're on hormone replacement therapy, we only want to help your body ease that process of making such extreme hormones and smooth that out and make it a little more gentle. But for example, a lot of people suffer really bad insomnia when they're in perimenopause, and then we put them on a little bit of bioidentical estrogen and they feel night and day better. And even things like night sweats and hot flashes, sometimes we can't get those things to be 100% better, but getting that to be 90% better can be a huge game changer for your life. And then having that really specific balance of estrogen, progesterone, and testosterone that can really help brain fog and mental clarity, especially if we're coupling that with appropriate thyroid production and adequate sleep. Like, you do want to wake up and feel refreshed and like you can focus throughout the whole day and think throughout the full day. Because if it's not like that, that just means that we haven't titrated the right perfect amount of hormones at the right doses, because everybody's unique. You're going to need certain doses of testosterone, you're going to need certain doses of estrogen, you're going to need certain doses of progesterone, and you want to make sure you know your body so you know what time to be taking those hormones and in what rhythm. For example, sometimes we'll have people take estrogen and progesterone every single day, but sometimes if you're a person who's still ovulating regularly, you're only going to want to take progesterone in your luteal phase in the second half of your cycle, because that's when your body's designed to make progesterone. But please know that if you start hormones, it definitely can be game changing, as in it can make you feel so much better, have radically more amounts of energy, clear up your brain fog, make your sleep better. And then if that's the case, we do want to be measuring your hormones, because you never want to get them too high. I would say that when we think about increased risks of cancer, usually that's because we're giving you way too much hormones for too long periods of time. So the goal is to just match your body's own physiology, what it's naturally designed to see, so that we protect you from having heart attacks, we protect you from having bone density issues, we make you feel amazing and great and have great energy every single day without ever making your hormones too high. And so even if you're on hormone therapy, number one, usually you want to titrate up to where you're feeling good and your labs are looking good. So if we start you off of 0.5 milligram of estrogen, for example, and you're still having insomnia 50% of nights, we'll double your estrogen and see how you feel. So you really want to be stable on your hormone dose, meaning that you're feeling really, really great 90% of days for about 3 months. And then we really assess every single month whether we should continue on that same dose, go up a little bit, go down a little bit. But then eventually you do want to make a weaning plan. Like, you do not want to be on hormones forever. We never want to use them as a band-aid. We always want to use them to support those natural transitions in the natural physiology of our body. So usually what I'll do when we start people on hormone replacement therapy for perimenopause is we'll have what I call discovery phase, meaning we have to see what's the best dose of hormone for you, whether that's a certain amount of estrogen, a certain amount of progesterone, a certain amount of testosterone. So we have discovery phase where we start you on something, we check your labs, we check your symptoms, we have to go up or down on your dose, and then eventually you find a dose where you feel amazing. And then we're on stabilization phase. So again, we have to keep an eye on your symptoms, keep an eye on your blood levels, make sure that your blood levels aren't too high or too low and that they're in the perfect range. And then we'll make a plan for weaning off of the hormones and transitioning into menopause. And so sometimes that will be over the course of 3 months, 6 months, but whatever that is, just do make sure that you discuss with your provider a weaning plan, so that you can have a plan to be off of them and that we're gradually coming off the hormones. But please know, if you're in perimenopause, do not despair. I want you to know that you're going to have to work harder than you did before. Like, our body in our 40s is just not the same as our body in our 20s. We can get away with way more in our 20s, way more runs to McDonald's and Chick-fil-A than we can in our 40s. However, you are not doomed to be feeling bad, to be gaining weight, to be having metabolic issues. Like, there's lots and lots and lots of things we can do to address all those different issues. There's different supplements, for example, and medications that we can use to do metabolic resets. And we want to make sure, like I talked about, your nutrition and your gut are healthy, so you feel like your metabolism is excellent and you know what to eat, and you're not having unwanted weight gain, and you're empowered to be making decisions every single day where you know how to balance your hormones, you know what the red flags are, and you know how to feel good. So that's our approach to perimenopause. We always start with looking at the whole body and all of the systems to make sure that none of them are off. And then we really look at the different root causes of the different symptoms. So why are we having anxiety? Why are we having insomnia? What's going on with our thyroid? Why are we having gut health issues? And then we look to address those issues. And then if we need to add supplements, we add supplements. If we need to add prescription medications, we always do that with certain goals so that you're always feeling excellent. We measure your levels, we measure your outcomes, we make sure that what we think is working actually is working, and that we have a weaning plan so that you're not stuck, quote unquote, on medications forever, just enough to help us transition our bodies as naturally as possible. If you want to know if you're in perimenopause, you want to have lab testing, you are in perimenopause and you're not feeling well, and you want help optimizing all these different areas of your life, please do not give up on your body. Please come and talk to us. We would be more than happy to help you. Check us out on verafertility.com. And thank you for joining us on this episode of the Hormone Cafe.